Well, good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Yeah. Slight height difference. Not a lot, but just slightly. Yeah, lovely to be here. I recognise some of you from when I was here over a year ago now. It doesn't feel that long ago, but over a year ago. It was interesting to hear about the football. I think there was a few boys from Ballymoney Baptist, which is my church, were along on Thursday night as well playing. And I did go and play football last January. And you shouldn't invite those Ballymoney Baptist boys, because if you go along, you might break your hip, which is what I did. And I had to get the whole thing replaced. And that's just playing football with boys from Ballymoney. So, you took your life into your own hands, inviting them last week to come and play. But what I will say is the last thing I ever did on the football pitch was pass the ball to Sturdy, who some of you know. And even though I fell and everybody heard the crack, Sturdy ran on and scored, and we won. So he did the right thing. He ran on and scored. He got a little bit of a slagging for it afterwards, but I was all for it, because the last thing I ever did in the football pitch was assist the winner. So I was all for that. But football is no longer in my life anymore, just as a watcher rather than a player. My wife isn't here, but I'm getting a dirty look from my daughter, because she's in the same opinion as my wife of I will never kick a football again. It was very kind to be invited along. And took me a long time. Jim asked me what I would name my testimony, and I never really thought about naming my testimony before. I'd shared my testimony quite a few times in different ways, but I'd never come up with a name. And as Jim was saying, nothing happens by accident, and the Lord plans everything. And the verse that Jim mentioned, where Paul was the chief of sinners, is that one verse that can save a life, which I'll come on to in a wee bit, and I'll be speaking on later on. So even in those small things of Jim standing up here to pray, I didn't tell him what I was speaking on. He had no idea at all. And there's the Lord working in his heart and working in mine at the same time. And it's amazing how the Word and how the Lord can work that way. I am a Korean man originally. Grew up in Ballysally and then moved to Milburn as well. So I went to both primary schools. I'm the oldest of three, and I'm the tallest of three. My brother's quite tall as well. My dad's tall, but it seems to have completely missed my sister. If you see us standing together, my sister's only about 5'5". I'm 6'10". And my brother is 6'4", so it does definitely look like it really skipped my sister. So that might eat at her a wee bit. Now, 5'5" is normal height, but when you're standing in our family, it is positively small. But grew up in Coleraine, really enjoyed my time in Coleraine. But the first thing I share in my testimony is I grew up in the 1990s, and every child in both estates that I grew up in went to Sunday school. No matter what, the buses would come round. Maybe some of them even came here, I don't know, but the buses would come round. They would pick up all the kids for Sunday school and they would go off. Now, the parents maybe wouldn't go to church, but every kid in Coleraine in those estates went to Sunday school. They heard the messages, they heard the word taught to them as kids. Most of them now, if you talk to them, may not be able to preach anything to you, but they could probably remember the name of their Sunday school teacher. They might remember some of the old songs. They might even remember something they were taught. But we never went. We weren't allowed to go because both my parents were atheists. They had no interest in religion whatsoever. They had no belief in it whatsoever. They had no desire to learn about it whatsoever. And they had no intention of ever sending us along to anything where it happened at all. The first time I walked into a church wasn't until I was 21 years of age. So I'd never been to a wedding, I'd never been to a funeral, I'd never heard anybody really say the word Jesus other than RE classes in primary school and secondary school. And even then, when you think about it, that's not teaching you about Jesus. That's like almost like a history lesson. These things happen. You've got to learn these things if you want an RE GCSE, which my claim to fame is I'm standing up here preaching to you. I've been to Bible college, but I failed my RE GCSE. I didn't get it. because whenever I was doing my GCSEs, I had the maths on Monday, I had RE on Wednesday, and I had English language on Friday. And my mum went, what would you ever need RE for? You need your maths and you need your English, so don't worry about RE. And here I am, over 20 years later, standing up in front of you all and having to admit that I didn't even pass an RE GCSE. That's how little religion played in our house. It wasn't even seen as important enough to get it as a GCSE, just to have another GCSE in hand. It was non-existent. Of course, we knew the very basics, because you learnt it in primary school, but it was the basics. Noah was on the ark. Moses parted the Red Sea. This guy Jesus died on a cross, and he was born at Christmas. But that was about it. That was as little as I knew. And even then, it didn't really seep in there, because again, it was just facts, daily facts of this is the stuff as a teacher I'm supposed to tell you, and that's it. There was no, you should do anything with this. This should be important to you. You should really be listening to what we're saying, other than just bang, 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 bang. So that was my life. What I will say that my parents were very good at, though, is we were always raised to be respectful of what people believed. If it wasn't for us, and that was fine, but we weren't to laugh at the other kids who maybe did believe. We weren't to belittle the kids who went to Sunday school. We weren't to try and convince them that we were right, that there was no such thing as God. We were to be respectful and kind, to the point of, if we were as a family walking up the street and somebody was handing out tracts, we would politely say thank you and take one, but we would walk on, and it wouldn't pay any heed in our mind. There would be no interest whatsoever. So that was early life, and like most people in the world, whenever I got to 18, it was almost accepted that where would I have my 18th birthday party but in a nightclub? What would I do? We would go to the pub as a group of friends. Whenever I was 18, I was 6'3", so tall enough, but I was really skinny and I looked about 12. So I was the youngest of my group of friends, so I was the last one that was able to make it into the pub, because they were definitely IDing me. If you've ever wanted to see the look of shock in a bouncer's face, walk up to them at 18 at 6'3" and them go, no, you do look about 20, I'm going to have to ID you. But they couldn't figure out how this guy who was that young could be that tall. My parents were not big drinkers. It was not like the lifestyle they had, but it was accepted. That's what 18-year-olds do, isn't it? You turn 18, you celebrate by going to the pub. That's life of the world. When I went to uni, we went to the pub. It was our place to socialise and enjoy life, and that was the way it went. That was normality. That is what most people live for. Most people live for now, on Monday to Friday they work, and they work all week, because Friday, Saturday night is going to be their time to celebrate. And maybe arguably the reason why so many kids went to Sunday school in the 90s is because mum and dad were looking rid of the kids for a couple of hours in the morning because they had a wee bit of a hangover going on. I think there might be some truth in that logic, and shouting kids maybe wasn't the best thing to be hanging around the house. But all that's changed, which is the saddest thing. Is when I grew up, we were the weird kids that didn't go to Sunday school. Now, my kids go to Sunday school, and they're the weird kids in the class. They're the minority now. Out of a class of maybe 30 for each of them, there's maybe 10, 15% go to Sunday school, and the rest don't. They're the weird people. They're the odd ones. We're the odd parents because we believe. And that's how things have changed in 20 years. Now, and I have to say this because one of my wife's friends is in this evening, so I have to say this because this will get back. So just so Barbara hears this. In February 2009, I have to get the month right, that would never go down. In February 2009, while I was working in the Causeway Hotel, I walked into the office and I was met by this woman who annoyed the life out of me and ended up getting me chucked out because I annoyed the life out of her. And in a few months, we're going to celebrate our 15th wedding anniversary. So even in that first moment of pure annoyance, we got past it. We were able to recover from that moment, and we're happily married to this day. But part of my testimony integrated a little bit of my wife's testimony because it's important. It's how I ended up in a church. Whenever Liz-Anne grew up in Ballymoney, she attended Ballymoney Baptist. Her father was a deacon. All the kids went. They went to Sunday school. They went to Bible class. They went to youth club, all those things. Liz-Anne was baptized as a teenager, and that was her life. It was mapped out that she was going to follow down that path. But she fell away. And if she were here, she would come up and she would share this as well, that she fell away at about the age of 18, 19. She didn't really have much of an interest. She was more rebelling against family and all that sort of stuff. She went to university. She got in with a crowd that were more interested in having fun and going out and partying and all that sort of stuff. And then she met me, who was interested in that sort of stuff as well. So we started going out. And as you can imagine, I can't say that her parents were overly thrilled that their daughter was going out with a man that had no intention of ever even walking in to a church. And then to make matters worse, within a month, we found out that we were going to have our son, who is 16 in a few months. So that definitely didn't go down well either. And even though Liz-Anne had completely fallen away, her parents were there for her. They helped her. They didn't turn their back on her. Of course they wouldn't. But it was definitely seen as not the right way to do things. Then our son came along. He was born on the 12th of June, 2010. And that's the day that, in hindsight, when I look back, even though it's still 17 months till I walk into a church, that's the day that my life changed, that I had to grow up. I had to wise up. I was 21, and I was walking into this hospital, and in front of me was this peaceful bundle of joy who didn't make a sound, who then started to cry. My mother-in-law was holding her in her arms, and I asked to hold him. I'd never held a baby before. There was no other babies really to hold when I was growing up. So I was like, okay, well, I have to make sure I'm good at this. I held this baby and he stopped crying. So that's my claim to fame. I got Jonathan stopped crying before my mother-in-law. But in that moment, I went, oh, everything's changed. Everything's different now. I have to be a completely different man. I can't be somebody who is living my life just for me, because this tiny thing in my arms now needs me. And that was the first step in that process. Me and Liz-Anne, we moved in together into a flat in Ballymoney, and we got married in April 2011. And 2 months later, randomly walking through Ballymoney, I asked Liz-Anne if Jonathan would go to Sunday school. And Liz-Anne looked at me as if I had asked her the craziest question in the world. She looked at me as if I had said, do we need air to breathe? She was like, what are you talking about? Of course he's going to go to Sunday school. He has to go to Sunday school. Sunday school is such an important part of a child's life. There is no way that he is not going to go to Sunday school. But that set Liz-Anne back on the path of going to church, because she realized in that moment, why was she so sure that our son had to go to Sunday school, but she had completely stopped going to church? She hadn't walked in the door in nearly 2 years. She had been so far removed from it. No interest. We didn't pray. We didn't read. None of that. There would have been nothing in our home that would have made you ever think that Liz-Anne had grown up in a church. You would have looked in the bookcase and I don't even think there was a Bible at the time. She still had Bibles, but they were packed away. There was nothing in our house that would have said Liz-Anne was born and raised in the church and, had a Bible, had memory verses up on the wall. Nothing like that. So in that moment, Liz-Anne realised that she had gone wrong in her life. So she started to go back to church from that summer. Now, as I said, we were raised to be respectful. So If Liz Ann wanted to go to church, that was absolutely fine. I was never going to stand there and go, how dare you go to church? For me, there was no need. But if Liz Ann wanted to go to church, if that was important to her, she could go. And that was absolutely fine. There was no problem at all. So off she went every week. And as she went along, she would go, she would come home. We wouldn't really talk about it. I would go, did you have a nice time? She would say yes. Every so often she might want to say, do you want to hear what we learnt today? I would politely say, no, thank you very much. And that would be about it. And that's how it went until October 2011. In October 2011, we were going down to Liz Ann's granny, who lived in Armagh, as a family. And we were getting a lift from Liz Ann's parents. And my father-in-law asked if I would come along to church, because we were all going to go off in one convoy together. He hadn't asked me before. Liz Ann hadn't pestered me every week, and I thought, I have come along. I've got the deacon's daughter pregnant. We had a child out of wedlock. I then married her, which again, biblically is wrong. And yet the McConvilles invited me into their home. They treated me like a son instantly. They never badmouthed me to anybody in the church. They were always respectful and kind and loving immediately to me, because that is who their daughter had chosen. Were they probably overly thrilled? I would imagine not. But they treated me completely like a son. So I thought to myself, either I could be rude and say, church isn't for me, or I could go, okay, I'll go along. I'll stand when I'm supposed to stand. I'll lower my head when I'm supposed to lower my head. I'll listen to the man up in the front speak about whatever he's going to speak about. And in my head, I thought church was just going to be like those episodes of The Simpsons where Reverend Lovejoy is standing there spouting off in a very monotone voice, everybody fast asleep, waiting to get through it to the end. But that was fine. I went along. I was welcomed. I sat down. I stood when I had to stand to sing. When it was time to sit back down, I sat back down. I lowered my head when it was time to pray. I don't know what I was thinking about, but I wasn't praying. And then Colin, the pastor at the time, got up and he preached on the verse I'm going to speak on later on, and the verse that Jim mentioned earlier about Paul being the worst of sinners. And the very little knowledge I had, I thought to myself, well, there's like three big rock stars in Christianity. There's obviously God, then there's Jesus, and then there's Paul. He wrote most of the Bible. So these three are like the big three. How on earth can this guy be saying he's the worst when he wrote most of the Bible? He's the best. He's one of the best. He has to be this great man. I couldn't understand it. So we left. I was curious. We went down. We had our barbecue. We had a very nice day. We came back. And so per is my knowledge about church life, I said to Liz, and I was like, do you know, that guy said something today that really sparked a question. Do you think he would have a coffee with me and we could have a chat? Thinking that, do pastors do that? Is that what they do? They'll come and chat with you and answer your questions? And she was like, yeah, of course. And that started a process of about 6 months where Colin came along and answered questions that I had. And sometimes I think back up and go, that man had amazing patience. I must have asked some stupid questions. But my knowledge was so non-existent that he would say something, I would go, well, what does that mean? I must have been like a 2-year-old. When a 2-year-old comes to you and they're going, why? Why's that? But what about this? But why this? But why that? But what? But he answered every question. And then I started asking the right questions. I started asking those questions about Jesus. I started asking those questions. And within a year, I would have said, yeah, I believe this God exists. But I wasn't saved. In my head, salvation was you believe he exists. If you do something wrong, you say you're sorry, and that's okay. That was the basic knowledge I had. I went along to church, not every week, but I was going along, maybe in the morning, maybe in the evening, here, there, and everywhere. And that was fine. But in November 2012, at this point, I would have said, look, I believe God exists, and anytime I do something wrong, I say I'm sorry. So, that should be okay. Everything's going well. But in November 2012, we found out we were expecting a child, which was great. And, we celebrated. We told my parents and Lisanne's parents. It was still early on, so we didn't tell a lot of people. And we got quite far to the point of we could start to tell other people. But about 2 or 3 days after we had started to tell people that we were expecting, Lisanne lost the baby. And of course, that was difficult for Lisanne. But I was angry. I was cross because in my head I had, well, I now believe in God. And these things shouldn't be happening because I say I'm sorry. I pray. I'm trying to read my Bible and learn. But this shouldn't be happening. I'm now a good person. I'm now a church person. None of this should be happening to us. Everything should be now going right. Every time I do something wrong, I say I'm sorry. So why has this bad thing happened to us? So I was really cross. I was upset and annoyed. And pastor came and visited and all that. And I just couldn't accept that this was, probably the right word is fair. It wasn't fair that this should happen to us. Because even though we had originally done everything the wrong way and we had Jonathan, now that we had apparently done everything the right way and we had this loss. But then 3 days later, I woke up at about 5 a.m. in sweat and tears because I knew I was wrong. And it had been the first time in my life I'd ever felt like that. If you knew the Burnetts, we're stubborn. We'll never admit we're wrong. We'll never admit that we didn't win something. If you'd ever played a game of Monopoly with us, those grudges could last weeks whenever we didn't win. And we'd remind each other the next time we played, you cheated last time, don't you dare. So we would never be convicted of any sort of, we would be that stubborn and that thran. And, if things hadn't gone the way they had gone, I could still be as angry now as I would have been then about the fact that we had lost that baby, because things wouldn't have changed in my life. But in that moment, I knew I was wrong. And I knew I was wrong to be angry with God. And I understood completely what Jesus had done for us on the cross. And that there would be difficulties, and there would be suffering, and there would be trials and tests. And on that Saturday morning, at 5:30 a.m, I gave my life to Christ completely, and then became a different person. I started to attend church every week. I started to pray properly, not just, sorry God for doing that wrong thing, but pray properly. I started to properly study the Bible and understand then that things will happen that are tough, that there will be trials and tests and difficulties. I understood clearer in my mind that these things would happen. But if you had met me before 2016, I was incredibly introverted. I wouldn't have said boo to a ghost. Whenever I was actually baptised in June 2017, I had to give my testimony like this, and I was so nervous. And it was only a shortened version, but it was enough so that you could be baptised. And somebody from the church, guy Mark, who I'm good friends with now, came up to me afterwards and said, "Do you know, Dale, I didn't know you could speak English. I actually thought that you were from somewhere else because you only ever said hello. And you only ever said goodbye. You said hello on your way in and goodbye on your way out. And you never spoke to anybody, ever. You were so quiet and insular and just wouldn't say boo to a ghost. Even when I was picking Jonathan up from FBI or something, I'd be like, hello, how are you maybe? Good, bye. And that was it. I wasn't friends really with anybody in the church. I didn't really associate with anybody in the church. I came and I went. But as I studied more on God's word, I saw the importance of fellowship, the importance of being part of a church. So after I was baptized, I really integrated myself into the church. I really devoted time to getting to build fellowship and relationships, because as Christians, we need one another. And then during COVID, I went to Bible college. I studied in Cornhill. And as I spent time in Cornhill and Belfast, I grew in my faith, my understanding of God's word. I grew in my confidence to speak and to share and to do this, with only a few nerves, but with a little bit more ease and comfort to be able to get up and tell people why my life changing was so important and how the Lord was using somebody who 10 years earlier wouldn't really have even known where to buy a Bible, let alone what the first verse was. Now, as the years progressed, our family grew in size. This is a picture from us from a couple of years ago. We now have 3 kids. We had 7 years between Rose and John, and then we had 11 months between Rose and Matthias. So we have a big gap and then a small gap. So we went from having 1 child to 3 kids very, very quickly, and that was quite a big wake-up call. But after I finished Bible college, I thought about possibly going into the ministry. But at that time, it didn't feel the right time, the right moment. We had young kids to go off to a college, to start from nothing. It just wasn't the right path. But I knew in my life I wanted to do more. I wanted to share the gospel as much as I could. Anytime I ever got the chance to share my testimony, I would. That previous picture there is 2 friends of mine. We've been friends since we were 11 years old. Neither of them are believers. They're probably the only friends I still have from before I was saved. And every opportunity I get, I share the gospel with them. That is us climbing Mount Errigal in the snow. And as we stood on top of the mountain, my 2 friends were like, "Isn't this amazing? This is beautiful. This is like outstanding, the snow and all that." And I was able to go, "Yeah, isn't it amazing what God can create?" And of course, because I've known them for 20 years, like, "Oh, there you go on about God's creation." But it's in those moments I get time to share just a little bit more about these things. And then they will ask a question. They'll go, "Well, like, how can you be sure? How can you be sure that this is God's creation?" And I can go, "Because I trust, I have faith." And he tells me that in his word. He tells me that everything that is created was his creation. Everything. And even with my own family, none of them are saved. And we pray for them all the time. I even had my mum one day say to me, she's like, "Are you still praying for me?" And I said, "Yes, yeah, of course." And she's going, "Do you not think it's time you maybe moved on to somebody else?" As if there was a statute of limitations. I'll only pray for you for a year. And if you're not saved after a year, that's it. We're moving on to the next person. You get 1 year out of this. And I was going, "No, we'll pray for you forever. We'll pray for every member of our family forever." And that is how my life has changed. I now can do this. I now work for a missionary organization. I go out and I share the gospel with people. I try and encourage other people in churches to share the gospel. I try and bring people who have never heard the gospel into situations where they can hear the gospel and hear it preached, and so they can go out and say, "I heard this really interesting thing about this man who apparently died for us." But that's the importance of the gospel. It's how important it is to me. And it's something we try and instill in our kids as well. Just before I finish and move on into God's word, I just want to tell a story of our daughter Rose. About 2 years ago, she really figured out what heaven and hell means. And she really then grasped what it meant for all those members of our family that don't believe. And she really struggled with it. And beside her bed now, there are 2 cardboard pieces of paper with all the names of those people in our families who aren't saved. And every night she'll pray for somebody else. But my dad lives in England, and my dad is clever. He knows how to avoid the gospel. He knows how to not open that door. The only time he ever did it was he had been to a funeral, and it was in a church. And he came to me afterwards and he said, "I went to so-and-so's funeral, and the first thing the guy said was, 'We're here to praise God.' And my thought was, 'No, we're not. We're here to bury him.'" Because he couldn't understand why anybody in that room would not be more focused on the person that had died and focusing on Jesus. That's the only time in 14 years I'd had the chance to share with him, actually, the person worth worshipping is not the person in the coffin, is God who has now taken that person and he's with him in eternity. So that was the only opportunity I had because my dad is clever and smart and kind of knows how to avoid it. But we went over to see him, and Rose was adamant that she was going to share the gospel. I think she was only about 6 or 7 at this time, maybe even younger, I think it was maybe 5 or 6. And she was adamant, and we went, that's okay. You share the gospel with your granda. And we forgot about it. We weren't going for a few months. We left, we went over, we arrived, and my dad was coming to meet us later on, and he came to the Airbnb where we were staying. And there he walked in and said hello, all that sort of stuff, caught up. And Rose had moved 2 chairs to sit in the middle of the living area. And she went, Granda, come here. And sat him down. And she just shared the gospel. He didn't get any ifs, buts, or maybes. He didn't open the door. She just went, and she told him everything. And he was sitting there going, and you know all this and all that, you know. And I was going, 14 years. 14 years I've tried to share this, and all it took was actually just going, sit. Sometimes it's okay to just be like, I need to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you it. Whether you want to hear it or not, I'm going to tell you it. Sit down. And the best thing that came out of that was we sat down to have dinner afterwards. He said thank you to Rose. He wasn't rude. He was like, thank you very much, and I'm really glad you told me that, and all that. And he was really nice, and he gave her a hug, and we all sat down for dinner. And Matthias, who was maybe only about 4 at the time, went to take a bite of his food, and my dad went, Matthias, do you not say something before dinner? We'd had dinner loads of times with my dad where he would just eat and go on ahead, and it meant nothing. But because Rose had shared with him, and because he understood why we believed what we believed, even though he didn't, he thought, I should respect what they believe. And he said grace with us, which is the first time he's probably ever really done it, where he actually bowed his head, he actually closed his eyes, and he waited for us to finish grace, and then he continued on. So the one verse that can change your life, I'll be speaking on in a minute. The other thing I could have named this is one invite can change your life. It all started because my father-in-law said, would you come to church? He didn't have to. We could have just travelled down independently. But he said, would you come? And I said yes. And as I've shared my testimony over the years, I've had people come up to me afterwards who have said, you know, I've been praying for my brother, I've been praying for a cousin or mum or dad or son, daughter, whoever it be. And they say, you know, we stopped inviting them because they always said no. But what you've shared reminded me is sometimes it just takes an invite. It takes that one invite where somebody might just go, okay. Not because they maybe have a huge desire to hear what's going to be said, but because they love you and they care about you and they think, do you know what? I've always said no. I will actually go along. I'll go along with them. I'll sit with them. I'll hear what they have to say because this person has asked me. That would be my challenge to you is invite somebody along. Even invite them for the 100th, 200th, 300th, whatever amount of times it is, even to the point where they're like, because you know what? Eventually they'll probably say yes just to shut you up. They'll probably think to themselves, if I go once, they'll never ask me again. And that one time could be the time where they hear that thing that makes them go, wait, what? What's that you believe? What do you mean I'm this? Nobody ever told me that. Working for a missionary organisation, there's loads of countries throughout the world where people have never heard God's word. They've never heard the gospel. We're fortunate here that we can hear the gospel, and we can see the gospel on a billboard. Sometimes you'll drive by, or you can see it on a bus, the message John 3:16. But sometimes you can sit with people who have never heard the gospel, and when they hear it for the first time, they go, wait, why has nobody ever told us this? This is amazing. This guy did what for us? And that's basically what it was for me. It was what I kind of have an idea of what sin is, and it's really bad, but this guy's a good guy. This guy Paul's like the good guy. How can he say this about himself? And it led to who you see before you today. The Lord opens doors and hearts in a second. And maybe you're thinking of somebody now that you used to invite, or you're thinking of somebody that you've maybe never invited because you thought they'd never come. I challenge you in the weeks ahead, there's still a couple more testimonies to come. There's kids clubs, there's Sunday services, there could be a quiz, men's fellowship, prayer meeting, whatever it is coming up. Invite somebody along. Bring them along. Let them hear. Ask them some questions. Challenge them a wee bit. See what they have to say. And maybe the first response will be, it's all right for you, but it's not for me. But it's now in there. And they'll never be able to get peace because something will continually be working in their heart and in their mind. And I guarantee it, they'll come back for questions. My two friends here are a prime example. They're not saved. They have quite strong left-wing political views. They would be quite strong in the laws passing in this country that are non-biblical. And yet, every so often they will go, do you remember when you said this to us? What did you mean? And what does this mean? And what does this mean for this? And what does this mean for that? So there's something still working in their hearts. Still. And they come to me because they know I'll share with them. I'll not bombard them. I'll not then go, oh, you've asked me a question, right? I bought you both the Bible and I'll pick you up at 9 a.m. next week and we'll go to church. No, I don't bombard them. I just answer their questions as they come. I give them opportunities to share. And sometimes they will just sit there and go, absolutely not. What a load of nonsense. Absolutely not. But sometimes you'll see them go, you have a point. And I'll just let that sit with them and then we'll pray for them as a family.